Hello and welcome to your MOOC course on English communication. Communication can be defined as the process of exchanging information, usually through a common system of symbols. The common system of symbols could be the language that we all speak and which is common to us. It could be body language that is understood by a select group of people. And it could also include bodily gestures which are universally acknowledged and acceptable. The word communication is derived from the Latin communicare, which means to make common. It can also further be defined as the process or act of transmitting the message from a sender to a receiver through a channel. The sender evidently is going to be the person speaking, the receiver, the person or the persons who are listening, and the message is the intended content that is supposed to be delivered to them by the message and the speaker. Now, let's take a look at what the message entails. The message is an intentional thing and conveys meaning in order to bring about further action or change. Let's take, for example, that you ask somebody to switch on the fan or to fetch you a glass of water. When that person listens, understands, and performs the action, we can say that the process of communication is complete. Communication can be imparted through speaking, as we just saw, writing, or using some other medium. There are various forms of communication, and the most common forms include speaking, writing, gesturing, and broadcasting. Therefore, communication means to inform, tell, show, or spread information. When a person communicates, he or she establishes a common ground of understanding. In the organizational context, it brings about a unity of purpose, interest, and effort. The important part here to note is that if good communication is established, it will make working together a far more better, easier, and more enhancing endeavor. Now, what is the nature and scope of communication? Let's take a look. The essential elements of the process of communication are the message, the sender, encoding, the message that is, the channel, the receiver, decoding, acting on the message, the feedback, and the communication environment. We'll make these things clearer in the next couple of slides, where we will also see this demonstrated in pictorial form. Now, both the sender and the receiver play a role in making communication effective. The sender is expected to encode the message accurately after considering the level, expectations, and needs of the target audience, that is the receiver. Now, what does this mean? This means that the intention should be to make the communication process as clear as possible. Our communication will depend largely on who our target audience is. So, in case we are addressing children, we will need to use simple language and simpler ways of communication. A more advanced or progressive audience can, of course, handle communication, which is slightly difficult, be it in terms of vocabulary, be it in terms of sharing ideas, or even the duration. As we all know, the average human attention span is approximately 40 minutes, right? So that's probably the reason why most classes in colleges and universities do not extend that time frame. That is an extremely important part that communication also has to pay attention to. The receiver should listen or read carefully to try and understand the intended meaning of the sender. So the participation of the receiver is equally important. Now, what are the various elements of communication? The universal common elements of communication are the communication environment, the use of symbols, and the presence of mental filters. We'll talk about all this in a little bit. Some basic facts about communication are things that we need to pay attention to. First and foremost, let's not forget, perfect communication is impossible. We all believe that we are able to communicate in a more or less perfect manner, especially when it is within maybe your friend circle or your family. But never forget that there is always going to be a loophole. And therefore, aiming for communication which is perfect is next to impossible. The meaning of a message is always going to be in the mind or the perception of the receiver. I cannot stress this point enough. What is the attitude of the receiver when he receives the message that you've sent him? Is the receiver being serious? Does the receiver perceive that you are joking or kidding or being sarcastic? Whatever the mindset of the receiver, your message is going to be conveyed in the exact same vein. So what you want to communicate is not as important as how the other person or the receiver wishes to receive this little bit of communication. And let's not forget, point number 3, personality affects the effectiveness of communication. A smiling person, a person who really and genuinely wants to talk to you, is always going to be better received than a person who is grumpy, a person whose body language is, let us say, off-putting, right? Or someone who is stern, strict, and tries not to make learning too much of fun. Now, what's the importance and purpose of communication? Communication, as we already saw, is the process of passing information from one person to another. The purpose is that whatever one wants to say should be clearly understood by the other person, or else the very purpose of communication would be defeated. Communication helps understand people better, removes misunderstanding, and creates clarity of thoughts and expression. It also educates people. This, of course, depends on whether you are a successful communicator or not. And we hope that by the end of this course, your progress in communication skills will make you a far better communicator than you already are. Now, communication may be written or oral, we are aware of that, formal or informal. These things we need to pay attention to now. Upward, downward, horizontal, diagonal, interpersonal, intrapersonal, interdependent, interdepartmental, and intra-organizational. Right, we will discuss each of these terms in a little while. Here is a simpler way of looking at the process of communication. As you can see, we start with the extreme left. You have the message, right, which is encoded, you move on, which is encoded through a medium. When it's received by the receiver, it is decoded. The receiver, who's now the sender, creates another message in response to the original one. He encodes it, right, sends it through the same medium and back to the original sender, who is now the receiver. Once this message is understood, the transmission process of communication is seen as complete. Let's not forget, there are 2 other stages that we need to take a look at. The first one is called the feedback stage, which is the second half of the communication process. Once you say something and the receiver understands, his reaction or his interaction or the way in which he responds is seen as the feedback phase. And most importantly, and we cannot stress this enough, there is always going to be some level of noise. Now, what do we mean by noise, right? Is noise only the literal meaning of noise? And the answer is no. Noise will refer to anything that can cause disturbances in this communication process. It could be actual noise, it could be metaphysical noise, right? Or it could just be confusion in the brains, either of the sender or of the receiver. Now, let's take a look at this process in a little bit more detail. Elements of communication. Communication is a continuous process which mainly involves 3 elements. We've seen this: the sender, the message, and the receiver. The elements involved in the communication process are as follows. Let's get this clarified. The first and the most important is the sender. The sender, or the communication generator, in general, is the person who generates the message and conveys it to the receiver. He's the source and the one who starts the process of communication. The message is the idea, the information, the view, fact, feeling, etc., that is generated by the sender and is then intended to be communicated further. Then we come to the process of encoding. The message generated by the sender is encoded symbolically, such as in the form of words, pictures, gestures, etc., before it is conveyed. Media refers to the manner in which the encoded message is transmitted. The message may be transmitted orally or in writing. The medium of communication includes telephone, internet, post, fax, email, etc. And of course, the choice of the medium is generally dependent on the sender. Decoding is the process of converting the symbols that are encoded by the speaker. Once the process of decoding is done, the message is received by the receiver. The receiver, of course, is the person who is last in the chain and for whom the message was sent by the sender. Once the sender receives the message that is sent by the receiver and it is understood in its proper perspective, we expect the receiver to act according to the message, and only then is the purpose of communication successful. Feedback is the next important stage. Once the receiver confirms to the sender that he has received the message and understood it, the process of communication is complete. So this means that we expect a reaction, all right, and a message from the receiver who says that, yes, I did understand what you were trying to ask or tell me or ask me to do. That is the complete progress then. The noise, as we mentioned before, refers to any obstruction that is caused by the sender, message, or receiver during the process of communication. For example, it could be as simple as a bad telephone or internet connection. It could be faulty encoding, right? That's also an issue. Faulty decoding, an inattentive receiver, very common. Poor understanding of the message due to prejudice or inappropriate gestures, etc. Right. Now, let us not forget what we said in the beginning. A lot of the communication process also depends on the mood and the receptivity level of both the sender and the receiver. So this could cause a major problem in the process of communication. Now, moving on, we're going to take a quick look at the various types of communication. So we have verbal communication, non-verbal communication, visual, and written. Now, verbal communication, the most simple of the lot, is what occurs when we engage in speaking with others. It can be face-to-face, it could be over the telephone, it could be via Skype or Zoom, etc. Some verbal engagements are informal, like chatting with a friend over coffee or in the office, in the kitchen, etc. Others are more formal, such as a scheduled meeting. Regardless of the type, it's not just about the words, it's also about the caliber and complexity of those words. How we string those words together to create an overarching message, as well as intonation. This would include pitch, tone, cadence, etc., used while speaking. And when occurring face-to-face, while the words are important, they cannot be separated from non-verbal communication. On a slight aside, it's important to remember that intonation plays a large part in the act of communication. The pitch refers to how loud you are when you're communicating. Your tone could indicate whether you're being serious or sarcastic. Yeah, and your cadence, which refers to the musicality of your voice, is also equally important. Right? A musical voice is one which soothes. Right? Doesn't mean that you're singing. It just means that your voice is soothing and does not cause agitation in your receiver. Now, let's move on to non-verbal communication. What we do while we speak often says a lot more than the actual words do. Nonverbal communication would include facial expressions, posture, eye contact, hand movements, as well as touch. Let's take a look at this example. If you're engaged in a conversation with your boss about, say, cost-saving ideas, it's important to pay attention to both their words and their nonverbal communication. Your boss might be in agreement with your idea verbally, but their nonverbal cues, stuff like avoiding eye contact, sighing, scrunching up their face, etc., indicate something different. So while your boss may be nodding at you, if he does any of these things, it means that he's not on board with your idea completely, and you need to investigate that further. Written communication is relatively slightly simpler. Whether it is an email, a memo, a report, a Facebook post, a tweet, a contract, etc., all forms of written communication have the same goal. And that goal is to disseminate information in a clear and concise manner. Though that objective is not often achieved, and even if it is rarely achieved. In fact, poor writing skills often lead to confusion and embarrassment and even potential legal jeopardy. If you're writing a contract, you need to be very, very sure of what you're putting down on paper, right? One important thing to remember about written communication these days, this is called what, the digital age, is that the message lives on in perpetuity. Nothing that you write and send is ever, ever, ever deleted. It can always be retrieved through one medium or the other. So be very careful about what you put out there. Thus, there are two things to remember. First, write well. And second, ensure that the content of the message is something you want to be promoted with or to be associated with for the long haul, right? Nothing that you say or do can be retracted, especially once it is put out in the world for others to observe. We move on now to the act of listening. The act of listening, unfortunately, often does not make its way into the list of types of communication. Active listening, however, is perhaps one of the most important types of communication, because if we cannot listen to the person sitting across from us, we cannot effectively engage with them. Think about a negotiation. Part of the process is to assess what the opposition wants and needs. Without listening, it is impossible to assess that, which makes it difficult to achieve what we call a win-win outcome. A win-win outcome is where you arrive at a compromise and neither party feels that he has been cheated upon or that he leaves the meeting in an unsatisfied, unhappy manner. Right? So very important. Now, we move on to visual communication. We are an extremely, extremely visual society. Televisions run 24/7. There's Facebook, which is a visual means with memes and videos and images. Instagram is an image-only platform, and advertisers use imagery to sell products and ideas as well. Right? We read less and we watch more. That is the society that we are all a part of today. Now think about this from a personal perspective. The images we post on social media are meant to convey meaning, to communicate a message. In some cases, the message might just be, look at me, I'm in Italy, or that, oh, I just won an award. Others are carefully curated to tug on your heartstrings, right? You will have images of injured animals, of crying children, etc. If you remember, there are always ad campaigns that try to raise money, right? Either for injured animals or for orphans or things like that. Think about the images that they set up, which are associated with these things. All these images are carefully curated in order to make you feel emotional, in order to make you feel responsible, and of course, in order to generate a certain kind of income, right? Anyway, so that's it for today's session. Thank you so much. I'll see you again soon. Have a great day. Goodbye.